What happens when the very person tasked with upholding law and order crosses a line and becomes the one committing the worst crime? In this story, the line between justice and corruption blurs, and what seems like a routine case of violence soon spirals into something much darker. Officer Malcolm Reed, respected, dedicated, a model husband and father. On the surface, he's everything a correctional officer should be. But beneath that well-crafted exterior lies a secret that no one could have anticipated. Then there's Jamal Carter, a confident, charismatic inmate who has never been broken by the prison system. His unwavering attitude earned him the respect of his peers, but it also made him a target. Now, the stage is set for a violent murder, a killing meant to silence a dangerous truth, but little did anyone know. If you're hooked and want to uncover the shocking details of how this twisted tale unfolds, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to our channel, and stay tuned for the full video. You won't want to miss what happens next. Malcolm Reed had built a reputation that most people would envy. At 42 years old, he was a former military man who had turned his discipline and command into a successful career as a correctional officer at Riverview State Prison. Known for his no-nonsense attitude, Reed was the kind of officer that every inmate feared. His unit ran like a well-oiled machine, and under his watch, order was maintained without question. He had the respect of his fellow officers and the fear of the prisoners, which was exactly how he wanted it. But beneath the uniform, behind the polished badge, there was another story, one that no one would ever guess. A story that contradicted everything Malcolm claimed to stand for. While outwardly he was a man of duty, inside, the pressures of his double life were beginning to take their toll. At first, it was subtle, an occasional glance here, a strange interest there, but soon others began to notice. Both inmates and fellow officers started picking up on his uncharacteristic attention to certain prisoners. The whispers in the halls grew louder as Reed's behavior shifted, his gaze lingering a little too long on the men who crossed his path. And then there was Jamal Carter. Jamal stood out in a way that no other inmate did. Where most prisoners shrank under the weight of Reed's authority, Jamal didn't flinch. He was bold, confident, and completely unafraid of Reed's intimidating presence. There was something about Jamal that made him different, a sharpness in his eyes, a cocky smile that seemed to dare anyone to challenge him. He didn't cower like the rest. Instead, he stood tall, his defiance making him almost untouchable. At first, Malcolm hated him. The prisoner's arrogance was something he couldn't tolerate. But over time, something shifted. What started as hatred morphed into something more complicated, an unspoken connection, an obsession even. Reed's interest in Jamal was more than professional. Something in him was drawn to the inmate's fearlessness, and that attraction would ultimately lead them down a dangerous path. The prison walls were about to witness a tension between them that no one could have predicted. But Reed's obsession with Jamal wasn't just a passing fancy. It was the beginning of something much darker that would soon shake the very foundation of Riverview State Prison. It started with a fire that burned between hate and fascination, igniting something in Malcolm Reed he could neither control nor comprehend. At first, he made Jamal Carter's life difficult, singling him out with harsher treatment than most. The other inmates were no strangers to Reed's tough approach, but there was something about Jamal that drew his attention in a way no other had. It wasn't just about power. No! This was different. Reed kept returning to Jamal, tormenting him 1 minute, then seeking him out the next, as if he was drawn to the very force that he despised. Late-night patrols that once went unnoticed turned into moments of quiet, whispered conversations in shadowed corners of the prison. No one saw these exchanges. No one could. Yet in the darkness, Reed found himself breaking the rules more and more. His emotions, tangled and confusing, began to govern his actions. The power he'd once wielded so confidently seemed to slip from his grasp when it came to Jamal. Every encounter left him with a sense of guilt, yet he couldn't stay away. The weight of his secrecy gnawed at him, knowing that if anyone found out, the consequences would be severe, both professionally and personally. Meanwhile, the tension didn't stay hidden for long. The whispers began, subtle at first, but growing louder. Fellow officers started to notice the strange connection between Reed and Jamal. The way Reed would linger around Jamal's cell, the way Jamal would look at him, not with fear, but with understanding. It was clear to anyone paying attention that something was going on. The atmosphere in the prison grew charged, like the still air before a storm. Then came Sergeant Dawson. The man had seen it all. Nothing slipped past him. He was the kind of officer who kept a watchful eye on everyone, and he wasn't blind to the strange dynamic between Reed and the inmate. One day, as Reed made his rounds, Dawson pulled him aside, his voice low but stern. "Watch yourself, Reed. People are talking," Dawson warned, his eyes narrowing with a mix of concern and suspicion. "Don't let this place get the best of you." The words stung, but Reed couldn't shake them off. Dawson had seen it. What was supposed to be a professional relationship was shifting into something far more dangerous. The prison walls seemed to close in on him, and the fear of being exposed became more real with each passing day. But even as his fear mounted, Reed couldn't stop himself. The forbidden relationship between him and Jamal had already begun, and it was spiraling toward a point of no return. It started with a feeling of exhaustion that Reed couldn't shake. At first, he chalked it up to the stress of his double life, the long shifts, the constant tension between his duty and his desires. It was taking a toll on him. But soon, the fatigue turned into something worse. He began losing weight, struggling to keep his strength up, and his body felt like it was fighting against him. Flu-like symptoms came and went, and Reed couldn't explain it. He was no stranger to stress, but this was different. The symptoms didn't fade. They only grew stronger. A visit to the doctor, meant to ease his worries, brought with it a shocking revelation. After a routine medical test, Reed was told the news that would change his life forever. He was HIV positive. The words echoed in his mind, rattling him to his core. How? He'd been careful. He'd always been careful. But as the days passed, one thought started to consume him. Jamal, the inmates, the late-night meetings, the moments in the dark corners, they all flashed before his eyes. Could it be? Was Jamal the one who had infected him? It was the only thing that made sense. The guilt, the shame, the fear. Suddenly, Reed was trapped in a nightmare of his own making. He had never imagined that this would be the cost of his obsession, his secret. Now, that secret was threatening everything, his family, his career, his reputation, all hanging by a thread. The diagnosis became an unbearable weight, one that Reed couldn't carry alone. His mind raced, the fear of exposure pushing him to a dangerous conclusion. He had to protect his perfect life, the life he had worked so hard to build. The only way to keep his secret buried, to ensure that nothing would ever come to light, was to eliminate the source of the threat, Jamal. The idea settled into his mind like a dark cloud, impossible to shake. The thought of silencing Jamal, of erasing the one person who knew the truth, began to feel like the only way forward. Desperation clouded his judgment, and the lines between right and wrong blurred completely. Reed's carefully constructed life was now crumbling, and the only way to stop it was to take matters into his own hands. The night Reed had been planning for weeks finally arrived. He knew the routine, the patterns. Jamal was scheduled for solitary confinement during his shift. It was the perfect opportunity. Reed made sure to position himself so that Jamal would be alone in his cell, isolated from the rest of the prison population. The dim lights of the correctional facility cast long shadows as Reed entered the quiet hallway, his heartbeat steady but tense. He approached the cell, silently preparing for the confrontation that was about to unfold. Inside, Jamal was calm, his usual confidence never wavering. He hadn't seen Reed in this light before, this side of the officer that no one knew existed. The walls between them had been built over months of whispered words and stolen moments. But tonight, There was no facade left. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut through. Reed entered the cell, his breath catching slightly as he locked eyes with Jamal. The silence between them was deafening, thick with unsaid words, with emotions neither of them had ever fully confronted. Jamal stared back, unafraid, as Reed stepped closer. Their unspoken animosity finally came to a head. "You ruined everything." Reed snapped, his voice raw, his anger spilling over. The weight of his guilt, his frustration, and his desperation came crashing down on him in that moment. In a heartbeat, the final straw broke. His hand reached for the gun holstered at his side, the cold metal pressing into his palm. Without warning, the tension snapped. Reed pulled the trigger. The sound of the shot echoed through the empty hallways of the prison, filling the space with a haunting finality. Jamal fell to the ground, the life draining from him in an instant. Reed stood frozen, watching as the light left his eyes. It was done. Jamal was gone. Panic set in almost immediately, but Reed's training kicked in. He wiped the gun clean, ensuring no trace of his fingerprints would remain. His mind raced as he staged the scene, setting it up to appear as though it had been an act of self-defense. The gun was placed near Jamal's hand, making it seem like he had been reaching for it. Reed quickly called for backup, his voice trembling as he relayed the news: a violent confrontation, a struggle, and a tragic outcome. When the authorities arrived, Reed stuck to his story. Jamal had attacked him, and he had no choice but to defend himself. His composure, along with his status as a respected officer, worked in his favor. The prison administration, keen to avoid scandal and protect their own, accepted his version of events without question. The investigation seemed to clear him, with the official report ruling it a justified use of force in self-defense. Reed was exonerated, his actions swept under the rug, as the institution closed ranks to protect one of their own. But deep down, Reed knew the truth. It wasn't self-defense. It was murder. And as the days passed, the guilt began to eat away at him. Knowing that he had taken the life of the one person who had ever made him feel truly seen, despite everything he had done to keep that part of him hidden, as the weeks passed, whispers began to spread through the prison. The official story had been accepted, but there were still questions. Inmates, who had been forced to remain silent in the past, began to speak out. Several prisoners came forward with startling testimonies. They reported hearing a heated argument between Reed and Jamal moments before the fatal shot rang out. The confrontation had been louder than anyone had realized. It wasn't just a simple altercation. Something had ignited a deeper conflict between them, and yet Reed's story didn't align with what they had heard. Meanwhile, the prison security footage, always reliable, had conveniently failed to capture anything that could help solve the case. Cameras near Jamal's cell had mysteriously stopped recording during that fateful night. It was almost as if someone had tampered with the system, erasing all evidence of what had really happened behind the prison's walls. It was starting to look less like an unfortunate tragedy and more like a calculated move to cover up the truth. Detective Lisa Monroe, a seasoned investigator known for her sharp instincts, was assigned to the case. She began digging into Reed's past with a meticulous eye. What she uncovered sent shockwaves through the investigation. Monroe discovered that Jamal had tested negative for HIV just weeks before his death. That was a crucial piece of information, one that contradicted Reed's accusation that Jamal had infected him. Reed's claim began to fall apart, and the motive for the murder was becoming clear. Reed hadn't killed Jamal out of revenge. He had killed him to cover up his own secret. Reed had been living a double life, hiding a truth so dangerous that he was willing to do anything, to keep it buried. Jamal had been the one person who knew too much, and in Reed's mind, eliminating him was the only way to protect everything he had built. His career, his family, his reputation, all of it was on the line. The investigation gathered momentum, and with it, the mounting evidence. Monroe connected the dots, leading to the shocking revelation that Reed had murdered Jamal in cold blood to ensure his secret would never be exposed. Reed, The respected officer who had once controlled the lives of inmates with an iron fist would now face his own reckoning. The trial was swift. The jury found Reed guilty of first-degree murder, and the judge handed down a sentence that would seal Reed's fate forever. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. And just like that, the officer who had spent his career in a position of power and authority now found himself on the other side of the bars. He was no longer the man in control, but the one being controlled. The final irony was not lost on him. He had spent his life keeping people in their place, only to be brought low by the very secrets he had worked so hard to keep hidden. Malcolm Reed spent his life living a lie. From a decorated military man to a respected correctional officer, everything he built was based on a false image. But in the end, that very lie destroyed him. His fear of exposure and his desperate need to protect his reputation drove him to commit the unthinkable. A man who had once held the power to control the lives of others found himself consumed by the very secrets he tried to bury. Was this a crime of desperation? Or was it the action of a man willing to kill to maintain his fragile hold on the life he had carefully crafted? Now, we turn to you. What do you think? Was Reed's crime driven by fear, or was it something far darker? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like this video if you were shocked by the twist in this story, and subscribe for more true crime tales that uncover the hidden truths behind the headlines. We've got more chilling stories just like this one, so stay tuned.